Good afternoon. Our guest today is Joseph Pearce, who we spoke to last August. I think we had a very interesting conversation about some of the books he's written, some of the biographies he's written about Chesterton, Shakespeare, Hilaire Belloc, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and his own autobiography, Race with the Devil, which is an interesting account of his own journey from being a member of the National Front when he was a teenager to being converted to Catholicism and becoming an author. His latest book is a book called Fate of Our Fathers, which is Joseph describes as a true history of true England, and which gives an account of the suppression of Catholicism under the Tudors and the development of Catholicism as a suppressed religion in England, which is a very interesting read. But I'd like to begin with a current topic which kind of relates to what we were talking about before, which is Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the context of what's going on in Ukraine. You've written, you had written even before the war about a very interesting piece about how Solzhenitsyn viewed the role of Ukraine within the Soviet Union and how he viewed it in relation to post-communist Russia. I think a lot of people would assume, if you read some of the kind of social media takes by people who would consider themselves to be on the conservative right and would probably consider themselves to be, people who would be supportive generally of Solzhenitsyn, seem to have made the assumption that Solzhenitsyn was still alive, that he might be supporting what the Russians are doing in Ukraine. But you, I think, correctly have taken a rather different approach.
Certainly. So I wrote an article several years ago, long before the war, called Solzhenitsyn and Ukraine Crisis, because, the whole thing's been bubbling up and building up for years, long before the war. And I quote Solzhenitsyn going right back to the 1960s from his friendship with Ukrainians in the Gulag, in the Soviet prison camps. And he was very aware of the anger that the Ukrainians felt towards certainly the Soviet Union, towards the communists, but also towards the Russians ethnically, for the way that they felt that the Russians had treated the Ukrainians over the centuries, and especially in the 20th century. And Solzhenitsyn's view was, it's complex. I'm sorry, you need to give me a minute here. Because Solzhenitsyn's view was basically that we need to give those areas of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union collapses, because he also prophesied that, this man's a great prophet, after the Soviet Union collapses, we need to give autonomy to those former members of the Soviet Union to have their own ethnic homelands, to have their own nations, and that includes the Ukraine. But he then also did say, and this is crucial, that the problem is that there's large parts of the territorial area, which is known as the Ukraine, which is ethnically Russian. So most of the east of the Ukraine is ethnically Russian, and those people don't want to be part of the Ukrainian Ukraine. They want actually to have closer links with Russia. So the whole thing is very complex and complicated. And what Solzhenitsyn talked about basically is the way forward is to respect minorities and to respect the Ukrainians need to respect the Russians within the Ukraine, and the Russians also have to respect Ukrainians. And what we need to avoid is what we've got, which is the whole thing disintegrating into war.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people have missed in the midst of the war and the crisis that preceded that. As you pointed out in your article, is that the Ukraine, as it is now within its current borders, was something that was created by Stalin, not out of any particular sympathy for Ukraine, but because it suited the Soviet purposes after World War II, when the Ukraine had a separate seat in the United Nations for a while. And so he committed genocide basically against the Crimeans. The Stalinists had basically decimated the Ukrainians during the Holodomor, and the two artificial famines that were the consequence of socialist collectivization. And it also encompassed then the Donbass region, which was settled by Russians, or had been settled by Russians a long time before that. So as you make the point, is that logical solution to the war would be, as you say, to offer autonomy to these people under United Nations supervision, and with all the peacekeeping paraphernalia that goes with this, rather than pursue an end game, which is...
Yeah, it's tragic. And I think there's all sorts of reasons for the war that could have been avoided. One thing, this is the conundrum. So the Ukrainian government wanted to enforce Ukrainian ethnicity, which is completely understandable. But this means that they were making it illegal or very difficult for the ethnic minorities in Ukraine, such as the Russians, but also Hungarians and Romanians, to actually speak their own tongue. So, they're trying to force the Ukrainian language upon the minorities to basically wipe out any sort of identity from those people. So obviously there's resistance. If you speak Hungarian, for instance, or Russian or Romanian, and the government says you're not allowed to do that anymore, you're going to resent it. On the other hand, Ukraine is trying to forge itself into a real nation, not some balkanized mess. So what you have is this butting of heads, which is inevitable in so-called multicultural societies. This is the problem, is that you create a multicultural society, and then you have all sorts of balkanization and ghettoization and ethnic antagonism that goes with it. Now, how do you solve that problem? Well, it's a real headache, quite frankly.
But it's interesting too that if you look at it in the context of where Solzhenitsyn was come from, he was very much a Russian nationalist in terms of his culture and his identification with the Russian Orthodox Church and its traditions. If you read the Gulag Archipelago and his other books, he was obviously, as you said, he formed very close relationships with Ukrainians. There was people of dozens of nationalities, including people from outside of the Soviet Union, Poles, Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans, Americans. There was a couple of Irish people, there was English people, there's people from all over the world who ended up in that horror, that hell that the communists created. Now, you never get the sense in anything that Solzhenitsyn ever wrote that he was a great Russian chauvinist. But there's also the thing too, I think that Putin has kind of he made a speech at Sochi last year, I think, when he was, before the war, he was obviously pitching himself towards conservatives and people on the right within Europe and within the United States, saying that, we in Russia, we reject all the nonsense of like transgenderism and multiculturalism. But he doesn't, if you look at the mess that Russia is even post-Soviet in terms of abortion rates, crime, social disintegration, corruption among Putin's own people, where people became billionaires by basically stealing state agencies. I mean, anyone who would possibly think that Solzhenitsyn would have any sympathy for those sort of people are obviously don't understand the first thing about him.
Yeah, I think that what sums up Solzhenitsyn's attitude was something he said to me when I interviewed him. So I went across to Russia, to his home just outside Moscow back in 1998 to interview him. And he said that people call me, a Slavophile, and he said, yes, if it's Slavophile means do I love my own people? Yes, I do. He said, but I don't see Russia as being separate from the West. He says, if the Iron Curtain had come down and all the cream of Western civilization had seeped over it into Russia, I would have rejoiced. He said, but what happened was the Iron Curtain came up and all the dregs of Western decadence crept in. And that's what I oppose. So we have to understand Solzhenitsyn's position. He's very much a Western man in terms of Western civilization and an understanding of Christendom, but he's certainly opposed to Western decadence. So, that's where we'll find Solzhenitsyn situated in all of this.
Iconic moments, I think, of Solzhenitsyn in the West when he spoke at Harvard, and the liberals who mainly constitute his audience were expecting him to, first of all, praise them for his being able to leave, which had nothing to do with them at all. He was expelled. He had no intentions of leaving if it was up to him. But so Solzhenitsyn made a speech in Harvard saying, actually, you people are not the alternative that I think Russia. And as you say, that's exactly what's happened since the fall of the Soviet Union. I'd like to move on to your books, as you mentioned at the start, Faith of the Fathers. I'd have known something about the history of Catholicism in England, particularly during the Tudor period, from its relationship with what happened in Ireland. But I found it very fascinating that I would have always considered, even though I would have known about some of the great martyrs of the 16th century, never actually realised how the way you contextualise into the entire sweep of English history, that almost like Stalinism in the context of Russia, that Puritanism and Cromwellianism was a kind of a deviation from, as the true England. Most Irish people, a lot of people here would not understand that.
Yeah, in fact, I'm very grateful that I have the opportunity to speak to my Irish friends as a true Englishman. Now, but the point about the history of true England is the England that remained true to the faith, true to Catholicism. So it's history of Catholic England. And what the rulers that treated Ireland so abysmally were also the same rulers that treated England's own Catholics abysmally. So Elizabeth I, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Oliver Cromwell, all of these monsters that behaved so diabolically to the Irish also behaved diabolically towards the English Catholics. And there was a period of 150 years from the 1530s until the 1680s, when it was illegal to be a Catholic in England, where it was punishable by death to be a priest, and punishable by death to hide a priest from the authorities. So I see that these English martyrs, and there were hundreds of them, these English martyrs to me are the true England. This is the England that I consider to be my true heritage. Those English Catholics that had the courage to stand up to the Tudor tyranny. That's the England that I am aligned to, that I am in love with, and of course that's an England that's completely and utterly at home with Catholic Ireland.
I would say one of my favourite kind of memes, if you are spoken memes or literary memes, is when I'm arguing with kind of orthodox lefties in Ireland. Say, well, one of the great monsters that you described, both of English and Irish history, Cromwell, was lauded for years as a hero of he was like the French Robespierre, or the French Lenin. He was the person who destroyed feudalism and the reactionary Catholic Church. He was the great Republican, and they just can't handle that because from their point of view, logically, Cromwell was on the right side of history, where of course he wasn't. He was a complete monster, as you described him. But one of the things, from after reading your book, I bought a copy of Father Gerard's book, the account of his time. Really horrendous, and the bravery of those people. I think, was it Gerard or perhaps a different chap who not only survived and escaped from the terror after horrendous torture, but spent, instead of escaping to France or Spain, as he could have, or pretty easily, remained in England for another 10 years.
You know what, Father Gerard, and then there's the other, whose name's escaping. There's another Jesuit who wrote his memoirs who also survived, but he did go into exile. So these Jesuits were so courageous because they knew that the moment they were arrested, not only would they be executed slowly and cruelly by the method of hanging, drawing, and quartering. We don't have to go into the deep, gory details, but one of the slowest and most horrible ways of putting someone to death. But before that happened, which is horrifying enough in itself, they would be tortured repeatedly because, of course, what the Tudor torturers wanted is the names of other priests, where the other priests were, where all the priest holes were, because many of the houses, Catholic houses in England, had secret priest holes, built in behind the walls or under the floor or in the roof. And they wanted to know where all of these were, so that when they raided houses, they could find the priests that were hiding there. So they tortured these priests repeatedly to try to get information before eventually giving them this hideous, slow, torturous death. So for me, these are some of the most courageous men in the history of humanity, quite frankly.
I just thought it was an interesting segue from that. You mentioned the Earl of Southampton, who was one of the main recusants, who was I think you say was kind of partly protected by Elizabeth for friendship reasons perhaps. And he was literally, scholars will know, he was one of the main patrons of Shakespeare. You would take the view that Shakespeare was a Catholic himself at that time of terror, and that that's expressed and comes across in his great plays.
Absolutely, and I've written 3 books on Shakespeare. One looking at the biographical and historical evidence, and the other 2 looking at the textual evidence from the plays. And it was illegal in England to talk about contemporary religion or politics on the stage. So they didn't want the stage to be used to whip up dissent against the government. So Shakespeare just got round that by setting his plays in other countries. So for Hamlet, for instance, set in Denmark, but Shakespeare's audience will know that there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, there's something rotten in the state of England, Hamlet ends with Shakespeare, with Horatio saying over Hamlet's body, "May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest," which is the prayer said at the graveside in the traditional Requiem Latin Mass, which was illegal in England at the time. And again, in King Lear, he talks about God's spies, and that was a reference to the Jesuits, who were seen as God's spies. So, there's loads that I could carry on, but the Earl of Southampton, who was sent to the Tower of London, lucky to escape from execution for his part in the Essex Rebellion to try to overthrow Queen Elizabeth, he was Shakespeare's patron and a recusant Catholic who had Jesuits actually as his personal confessors.
Would you have looked much then at the connection between, say, some of the English recusants and people like Stanihurst and Campion who were in Ireland at the time? Was there much of a connection there?
Well, I think that obviously the English, one of the reasons that the Earl of Essex fell out with Queen Elizabeth is that Queen Elizabeth wanted the Earl of Essex to go to Ireland and basically butcher the Irish, and instead the Earl of Essex came to a peace agreement, with the Irish, and that made Queen Elizabeth extremely angry. It's one of the things that sparked off the Essex Rebellion. So certainly the Earl of Essex was not a Catholic, but he was sympathetic. So obviously the Catholics in England had common cause with the Catholics in Ireland who were being persecuted. By the way, very interesting fact here, Matt. For those of you who know about my past, we can't talk about too much perhaps, but I, amongst other things, I was a member of the Orange Order, so you and I would not have been on the same side in days of yore. But now, in my book, Faith of Our Fathers, I'll talk about the so-called Glorious Revolution, which is obviously celebrated by the Orange Order as the grossest and most grotesque act of treachery by any people of any nation. Because basically what happened is that we have a legitimate king, King James II, who's a Catholic. And by this time, Parliament and the merchant class have so much money and so much power. What they do, they pay a foreign army to invade their own country to depose their own king. Can you think of anything about, it's a revolution, a glorious revolution. It basically is an act of gross treachery. You actually pay an army of foreign mercenaries to invade your own country to remove your own legitimate monarch. And that's what the Orange Order has loyalists to the United Kingdom celebrate. You just have to be ignorant of history to actually to have that perspective.
And you go into in the book about the legitimacy of the monarchy and the overthrow of Mary, Queen of Scots and all that. English people generally, are they conscious, are they aware of the sort of history that you detail in your book about the religious background, that kind of the anti-Catholicism aspect?
The English are very anti-Catholic, but that's because they've been fed a false history. And one of the reasons I've written my book, Faith of Our Fathers, A History of True England, and the reason other great historians, such as Hilaire Belloc, wrote a whole series of books, and William Cobbett's History of the Protestant Reformation, to show that the official history of England, the history that everybody was taught, the so-called Whig history of England, is false. It's Protestant propaganda. It's basically the victors rewriting history to justify their own position. So, for instance, you mentioned the Jacobite uprisings. The Jacobites were supporters of the sons of James II, the descendants of James II, who was the legitimate king who was overthrown. And I would say, yes, you're absolutely right. The Scottish were Jacobites, the Irish were Jacobites, but English Catholics were also Jacobites, and they fought in both of those Jacobite uprisings in the 18th century. So we have common cause, and I think that's important. And an interesting thing, by the way, as regards to the coming coronation, Queen Elizabeth II was at great pains to sympathise with the Jacobites, because she, through her mother's side, she was related to Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the founder of the Stuart dynasty in England, of course. So she sort of, she wanted to distance herself from the Tudors. So the whole thing, the more you understand this whole monarchy thing, the more confusing and foggy it becomes.
It's very interesting kind of a resonance too in Ireland of like you're talking about the history of true England. There's kind of a minor historical controversy here. It doesn't get much attention because it mainly concerns historians who've done more research in Irish language sources rather than state sources. And it kind of goes against the kind of received history from an Irish Republican point of view, where it's kind of like it began in the 1790s with support for the French Revolution and the United Irishmen, whereas Irish Gaelic scholars point out that there's a whole, the kind of mythology, the millenarian hope of the suppressed Gaelic nation as expressed through Irish poetry and the prose that was written at the time was Jacobite, and that lasted way beyond, I think, even the last plausible Stuart successor. And that's people who haven't or who couldn't read the original Irish source were confused about that, saying, why would monolingual Irish speakers in the 1790s who would have had no connection, they wouldn't have been able to talk to Wolfe Tone and Robert Emmet because he had no common language. Tone and Emmet couldn't speak Irish and they couldn't speak English, and they certainly couldn't read English, and yet they still, their ballads and the poetry that survived was about, they confused it into historical memory, but as in their minds, in the folklore, the idea that the French Republicans were going to send an army to liberate Ireland was, in their mind, exactly the same thing as it would have been with the Spanish Armada or the French army or the Jacobites in the 17th century or the 18th century. It's very interesting, and it's intimately bound up with something, again, which lots of Irish Republicans and nationalists choose to ignore, the deep part that the Catholic faith played in both our countries, and a lot of people would prefer that was completely ignored in the present time.
Well, certainly, from as I see it, what makes Irish history so noble, someone should write. Maybe someone has done it already. Something like I've just done. Faith Our Fathers: A History of True Ireland. Because really, what makes Ireland a noble nation is Irish resistance to the efforts by the English primarily, to stamp out their own faith, and the resistance to that, and the refusal to surrender to that. Now, to think that Ireland, that noble history of Ireland that goes back hundreds of years, to St. Patrick and what have you, that whole noble history should be subjugated to belief in the French Revolution, to secular fundamentalism. I mean, that's what has led to Ireland being basically a slave of the European Union, to this secular dynamic. And Ireland needs to get in touch with its roots. And certainly, although I don't speak Gaelic, I have friends who are that are very into some of the Gaelic poets of Irish history. And that's where my sympathy lies. And insofar as I hear, I was listening watching yesterday a video of a setting of a Gaelic folk song by a husband and wife whose name escapes me now, but the poet was from the Aran Islands, and he died, I think, in 1980, that sort of time. Now, this is the Ireland that I find myself very attracted to. This sort of mystic West, so to speak. This island with authentic roots in ancient history, not that's sold its soul to 21st century secular fundamentalism.
But that's the thing too, with the whole Cromwellian Puritan period, even though it didn't last very long, there was kind of the equivalent of Stalinism, wasn't it? In that it suppressed not only the Catholic religion, its literary tradition, as Solzhenitsyn pointed out, is has to have a tradition. And the great Soviet novelists, like his name off the top of Shakespeare, was it, who wrote the book about building the great canals, that literature hasn't survived because it wasn't based on anything, and that the worst kind of propagandist poetry of the Cromwellian period hasn't lasted either, because it was too simplistic. And once you lose your roots and tradition, you also lose your literary and your artistic traditions. And I think you explain well in the book too what a major part both Catholics played both in the revival of the great English literary tradition of the 18th, 19th centuries, but also how people who were converted to Catholicism found that path through exploring Shakespeare and the older literary traditions.
Yeah, well, beginning with Cromwell, obviously Irish people do not need reminding of Cromwell's monstrosities in Ireland. But we need to remember that obviously he was monstrous towards England's Catholics. He closed the theatres. The theatres were shut down altogether during Cromwell's reign. And the other thing, they even banned Christmas. Now there's people that, if anybody's read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, that the White Witch, it makes it winter but never Christmas. Well, that was true in England during the reign of Oliver Cromwell. In actual fact, the figure of Father Christmas rose as an icon of resistance to Puritanism. Sir Christmas was part of the medieval mystery plays, but he was resurrected as Father Christmas, because this is like Robin Hood. Father Christmas, like Robin Hood, bring us back the good old Catholic Merry England and get rid of this tyranny we're living under. And just to expand on the other point, the great literary revival in England in the 19th and 20th century was almost solely due to converts to Catholicism. So St. John Henry Newman was a convert to the faith. G.K. Chesterton, J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings. I mean, he was a cradle convert. His mother converted and had both her sons received into the church at the same time. So these giant figures, Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, you could carry on. These giant figures of English literature in the last almost 200 years now. Many of the greatest English writers are converts to Catholicism. So there's this living Catholic subculture in England, which actually produces some of the best things that we've seen in the last 200 years.
How would you, since the last time we spoke, and another year after Biden and Harris being in power, how do you see things?
Certainly, we're living in a rather tyrannous time over here. When I arrived here 20 years ago from England, all secular regimes have problems. The United States was certainly not a paradise when I moved here, but there was certainly much more freedom. Of course, at 9/11, that stripped a lot of freedoms away. But we're now living in a polarized society where dissidents are being silenced, imprisoned. There's, for those of us that have studied the Soviet Union, it's somewhat creepy that basically those who oppose, for instance, the transgender agenda, that want to restore the traditional family as the root and basis of a healthy society. These people, even being called terrorists or sympathetic to terrorism, just by holding the beliefs that everybody held, or almost everybody held, until about 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, it's an astonishing situation. And what I think about is, the saying, you give the devil enough rope and he'll hang himself. And I think that the devil's got enough rope now. The problem is that, before the devil hangs himself, and we saw in the Soviet Union that G.K. Chesterton said the best way of destroying a utopia is to try it. This is madness. it's not sustainable. It will come down of its own volition, as the Soviet Union did. But you give the devil enough rope, he will hang himself, but he'll hang other people first. He'll hang innocent victims first. And what we're going to see is people that are going to be persecuted, thrown in prison, possibly killed because of their courageous response to this postmodern nonsense. And again, there are parallels here with the English martyrs, and that's the whole point. History empowers us. In understanding the past, we can understand the present much better. We can see the future much better. Quite frankly, the reason history is so important, Matt, is that if we don't know where we came from, we don't know where we are. And if we don't know where we are, we can't know where we're going. So we do have to have this knowledge of history to guide us in the perilous present moment in which we find ourselves.
It's very interesting that you mentioned the transgenderism thing, because we could kind of see a bit of a shift happening here. Now, we would be considered by left feminists, generally speaking, as kind of like debate or they've had nothing to do with us. But we've had interviews with people coming from that standpoint, and the common ground is for them that, you know, the fact that men are, large bearded men are playing with 14, 15-year-old girls, that's something that's just gone beyond their comprehension. But at the same time, people who are not left feminists, people in this country who are members of what were, up to 20 years ago, centre-right, conservative, mainly Catholic parties, that their leaders have chosen this hill to die on, and they defend there's TDs, there's ministers who will put to the pin of their collar, will refuse to say, as you say, what people have recognised for millennia as biological facts, and they're terrified because they think that their political careers will be ruined. And I was talking to somebody about this a few weeks ago, and I said, well, why? Now, this person would still be kind of on the soft left. And I said, like, why are they so insistent that this is accepted? And I was saying, it's for exactly the same reason that the Stalinists put people through these ridiculous, absurd show trials and got them people who've been communists all their lives, who've gone through the Nazi concentration camps, who were then arrested in Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary after the war and tortured into saying that they were agents, that they'd been Gestapo agents since they were 9 or 10 years of age. Nobody believed it. But that wasn't the point. It was the point was that the state could make them say these things and make other people either believe them or shut up and pretend to believe them. I think that's exactly what's at the heart of this transgenderism thing. In the heart of heart, anybody with any sort of intelligence, any sort of knowledge of human beings or human history knows that this is absurd. But the reason they insist upon it, and the reason they've let the extremists take up the running and set the agenda, is because it's part of something else. If they can make us accept this, then they can make us accept anything.
Absolutely. I mean, the terrorizing of dissident opinion is something which is part of totalitarianism. Now, again, whether that's Stalin, whether that's the Soviet Union, whether it's Elizabeth I and Tudor England, writing of Elizabeth I, and the historian said the judicious use of judicious terror. In other words, using the law to terrorize enemies of the government. And we need to understand here that at the heart of it is that these people with radical agendas know that the enemy of what they want is the traditional family. They have to disintegrate, destroy the traditional family. And that's the end game for them. And what we have to realize is that all these ideas of pride, the pride movement, and empowerment and self-empowerment always leads to the weakest being abused and destroyed. So we have babies in the womb that are being abused and destroyed. When you have single parents with multiple sexual partners, it increases exponentially the rate of sexual abuse of children. So it's those who don't have a vote, who don't have a voice, are the victims of this empowerment movement. And that's the irony. In the name of looking after the rights of persecuted minorities, they're actually handing over the weakest members of society to be destroyed and disposed of and abused.
I think it's interesting too that what you're talking about, the place of the family. But if you look at history, you look at what what happened, what was there before Christianity, what was there in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries when Western tradition nearly collapsed under the barbarian invasions. It was the Catholic Church who established basic human rights. Nothing was, even if you leave aside the whole religious aspect, it was the Catholic Church who established the right of people not to be forced into marriage, that rape was no longer the basis of marriage. If you could abduct somebody, you could force them to be your wife, no matter what age they were. That ended infanticide. Infanticide has been in by abortion. All these horrors, these were the day-to-day realities of paganism, not like witchcraft, white witches running around helping people and curing people of cancer. The closest we've seen to that in our time is what happened in Kampuchea and in Maoist China in the 1960s and the early 1970s. That's the sort of society you get when there's no families, when you destroy every other structure that keeps society together. That's what you get, not some sort of happy, clappy paradise on earth.
Yeah, I mean, again, look at it. What happens when God is removed from society? We've done the experiment already. We have the evidence. The French Revolution, right, it dissolves in the reign of terror when they first of all, they start off by killing the rich and then killing Catholics and killing nuns, and then end up killing themselves, so that the revolutions devour themselves. And then we tried it again. We tried it again throughout the 19th century. We tried it again in Russia and the Soviet Union. We tried it in communist China, Cambodia, the Nazi Germany. You know, what happens when you put this experiment of removing God from society into practice? We've seen it. The answer is tens of millions of people butchered by the government. You know, the guillotine, the gulag, and the gas chamber is what happens when you remove God from society, and we should add the abortion mill to that.
The Irish Dáil Parliament passed an extreme hate speech bill last week, which interpreted certain ways would mean that myself and yourself could perhaps end up in front of the judge again, but for different reasons. And it was ironic that the TD, and in fairness to him, I credit to him in an article I wrote about, was a Trotskyist TD who had gone along with this up to a certain point, and then the kind of penny dropped, and he said, well, you know, okay, we don't really mind you going after Gript or Joseph Pearce or the pro-life movement, but what's to stop them coming after us? So there is that kind of spark, because the Trotskyists were victims themselves, even though they'd helped to create this monstrosity. They were one of the primary victims because, as you said, the wolves devour one another, as the Polish proverb said, and they were the first wolves, and like hard to be sympathetic to them in some ways, but at least they have some sort of historical sense.
All that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And what happens is people are bullied, so they either conform, you know, even if they don't really believe something, they say what they know they have to say in order to be accepted in their job and in their society, or if they are a little bit more courage than that, they say nothing. In other words, they remain silent. But that silence is not enough. We have to have people that have the courage to stand up and be counted and say that where this is leading, you know, and once you get rid of free speech, I think it was Voltaire that said, I may despise what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. That when we stop valuing freedom of speech in a society, totalitarianism is inevitable. And you mentioned the Trotskyites, it doesn't really matter, quite frankly, whether the jackboot that crushes your head is on the left foot or the right foot. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're being crushed by the Nazis or by the communists. When there's no longer any freedom, right, what you have is tyranny, irrespective of the ideology, the label that it wears. All right, every word we use is a cultural construct. All of these people, if they're not going to be hypocrites and they don't believe in cultural constructs, then they just start grunting with each other, take all their clothes off, and die of the cold when the first winter comes along. They go, every word they use is a cultural construct. Of course, we are rational beings. We bring sanity from madness, right? Sanity, bringing reason into the ball game, right, is not something which is bad. And just to dismiss that as a cultural construct is absolutely nonsense, especially say that families go back in every culture for as long as anybody knows. So basically to ditch the whole of history and every culture that's around today and every culture that's ever been around ever for an experiment based upon an ideology is madness. And thanks be to God, for the goodness, truth, and beauty and reason, which is what we have as human beings, and we have to learn to use it again, because otherwise we're going to end up in the insanity that these people try to impose upon us.
I think you just return towards the end to Solzhenitsyn, that one of the things struck, and I would have been pretty militant in the 80s when I first read the Gaelic Archipelago, but it was as if I was meant to read it because it was a turning point in the way I looked at Marxism and revolutionism at the time. One of the things that struck me, and I think Solzhenitsyn was an atheist when he went into the camps force, that he identified the old believers, the old Orthodox believers who've been persecuted for centuries, long before the communists came to power, that they seem to be the most cohesive people and the people who retained their dignity the longest. The horrors that were going to camps, everybody else fell apart. And he realised why, because there's something more than just their individual survival that kept them going. And I remember reading about people in the German camps as well, in the concentration camps in Dachau and places like that. There was people of faith, of not just Catholic faith, Jews and Jehovah's Witnesses and Lutherans, that they retained their dignity. They didn't let the Nazis, they didn't let the Stalins turn them into animals, because they realised there was humanity, human beings were above, that we weren't just creatures who were fighting for the next bowl of porridge. There was something more to us. And as long as we retain that, I'd be kind of optimistic that spark will never be extinguished. But perhaps it will, I don't know. Would you be optimistic in that sense?
Well, yes, absolutely. And as the society gets more tyrannical, then the concentration camp or the gulag becomes a metaphor for the whole of culture, right? When you no longer have freedom, when you're threatened with imprisonment, if you speak up against the power of the government, then we are all living in this large, extended concentration camp. And we talk about Solzhenitsyn. I would encourage people to read Solzhenitsyn's short novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, because it's only about 120, 150 pages long. But what you see in there is what you've just said, Matt, that the character in it who's happiest in the gulag, who won't be crushed by the system, is Alyosha the Baptist. It's the Christian who's in the midst of the atheist, is the one who can survive, and not just survive, he can give encouragement to the non-believers. And of course, ultimately, encouraging non-believers is for them to become believers, and they will be encouraged themselves. But these people, the transgender people, the communists, the secular fundamentalists, the globalists, they know what the enemy is. The enemy is Christianity. And the enemy is specifically Catholic Christianity, because not just because Catholic Christianity is the largest, it's also the most organized, and it's all over the world. And if they can crush the church, then they think they've won. But as Jesus Christ promised in the gospel, the gates of hell will not prevail, and that's why we should take courage.
Well, on that note, I think we'll part again. Thank you again for the most interesting conversation, and good luck with the book and your other projects, and hopefully we speak again soon.
Thanks very much, Matt. It's been a pleasure. God bless you.
Anybody who's interested in following up on more of what you're at the moment, they can look at your website, which is... Yes,
so if people will keep up with what I'm up to, then I update my personal website every day, just about. So it's jpearce.co, jpearce.co.